Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Lynch, the Provost of Brandeis University, and I welcome you to this afternoon's forum on how do race, ethnicity, and religion intersect with sexual violence. This afternoon's discussion is being recorded, as you see, both live streaming for Facebook page out of the Schuster Institute and more generally, to be able to be used as an educational source of material. So I just wanted to inform everyone of that. To assist us with the recording, may I ask you to turn off your cell phones so that your cell phones do not become recorded into posterity in today's recording. When Professor Brooten approached me about the concept of organizing this discussion, I was very enthusiastically said, absolutely, we must have this discussion on our campus, the first of many, and I want to assist in any way that I can. And I thought, as a way of sort of beginning the discussion, that thinking back historically might be helpful. More than 25 years ago, a Brandeis professor, she wasn't Brandeis professor at that time, but a Brandeis professor, Professor Anita Hill, took the very brave decision to stand up and speak truth to power and articulate in Senate hearings what so many in our country had experienced on a daily basis and continue to experience on a daily basis in the context of sexual harassment and the intimidation, humiliation that is experienced by far too many people in the workplace. She spoke truth to power, and many of us who watched her at that time testifying in front of the all-white male panel on the one hand, we're encouraged that she articulated experiences that we were having. And it was very empowering, but nevertheless, it didn't truly break out in terms of women in particular, but others who are intimidated and sexually harassed in the workplace and other settings. We didn't have that powerful voice. So there was a reassurance that, yes, this is something that is now out in the public space, but it was still something that many of us sort of grinned and bared it and continued to try to advance in our careers, in our settings, in our organizations, and sort of live with that. 10 years ago, in 2007, a black woman named Tarana Burke originated the Me Too campaign. She was the founder of a youth organization called Just Be Inc., and she wanted to create a grassroots movement to reach sexual assault survivors in underprivileged communities. I mentioned both Ms. Burke and Professor Hill because these are two very important points in time over the last 25 years in which black women led the discussion and campaigns that today, as we look at the Me Too campaign and all that is associated with it, this is a campaign that has been more than 25 years in the making and whose originators are two very powerful, strong black women. So I hope that we acknowledge that history, respect the contributions that these amazing women and many others have made in the context of how we engage in issues in discussion and responses to sexual harassment and sexual violence in our society. So we have a terrific panel to engage in that discussion further, a wonderful audience. So I turn to Professor ChaeRan Freeze, who will now continue the program for today. ChaeRan.
Thank you. So a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here today. Today's panel discussion will explore the intersection of race, ethnicity, and religion with sexual violence. To borrow Kimberly Crenshaw's analogy, like victims of a traffic accident at an intersection with cars traveling in multiple directions, individuals who suffer sexual violence often experience multiple harms simultaneously, having to deal with the attendant stereotypes that accompany the identities that they embody. Survivors not only have to process their own trauma if they choose to report the rape, some women, especially women of color, confront skeptical law enforcement officials, legal systems that cannot deliver justice, and social stigma in their own families and communities. For African American and Native American women in the United States today, unpunished violations of their bodies echo the larger histories of sexual violence that took place in the past in the context of slavery and settler colonialism. We hope that today's frank but sensitive discussion about sexual violence will provide nuanced perspectives and concrete ideas about how we as individuals, students, educators, and practitioners can engage with these issues. I want to point out that staff members from the Brandeis Rape Crisis Center are available for support during this event, and they're wearing t-shirts that identify them. Can you stand up for 1 minute? Okay, so they're right here. Okay, thank you so much for being here. I want to introduce our first speaker, Professor Bernadette Brooten. She's the Robert and Myra Kraft and Jacob Hyatt Professor of Christian Studies, named a MacArthur Fellow in 1998, and she's the founding director of the Feminist Sexual Ethics Project. This project aims to create Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sexual ethics rooted in freedom, mutuality, meaningful consent, responsibility, and the pleasure of each participant, untainted by slaveholding values. She has written numerous books, including Women Leaders in the Ancient Synagogue, Transcriptional Evidence and Background Issues, Love Between Women, Early Christian Responses to Female Homoeroticism, for which she received 3 awards. And with the editorial assistance of Jacqueline L. Hazelton, she edited Beyond Slavery, Overcoming Its Religious and Sexual Legacies. She has also published on various topics in ancient Jewish and early Christian history. She is currently writing a book on early Christian women who were enslaved or who owned enslaved laborers, including owners' sexual access to their enslaved labor force. Professor Brooten serves as a member of the Brandeis Task Force on Sexual Assault and is co-investigator under the direction of Laurencia Jefferson, who's sitting right here, of research on hindrances to Black women's reporting of racial harassment, violence, and sexual harassment. Drawing on previous collaborative research on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in relation to the history of slavery, Professor Brooten will speak today about religious traditions and the differing challenges faced by survivors of sexual violence in various ethnic and religious groups. So thank you for being here.
Sexual violence happens in all communities, but differently in each, and never in a vacuum. Today, I will outline very briefly just some of these differences so that each of us can help to reduce rape and sexual assault in all communities, so that everyone can enjoy the protection of the law, and so that we can respond to each rape survivor in culturally appropriate ways. Only by addressing culture, religion, economics, politics, and differing access to legal protection can we dismantle specific rape cultures. Beyond this, rape has a history that matters in the present. Some of what I say today may be triggering. If rape were not cultural, the rates should be the same all over the world and across ethnicities within each country. But that is not the case. According to a UN study of sexual and domestic violence in 6 nations, in one country, 9.5% of men reported having raped someone, while in another, 62.4% admitted to having done so. In the first, 0.5% of men stated that they had raped someone in the past year, and in the second, 25.2%. So we are talking about rape culture, or rather rape cultures. Economic and political circumstances can determine a survivor's access to legal protection and other resources. History matters too. Sexual violence across generations, such as against Native Americans and African Americans, can lead to feelings of inevitability and hopelessness. Native Americans experience the highest rate of sexual violence in the United States, and 70% of rapes against Native women are by non-natives. Tribal authorities are not allowed to arrest or prosecute non-native suspects, which gives white and other non-native offenders free rein. Religious traditions can be the most powerful source of healing or can contribute to the belief that a victim is responsible for not following the religious values of virginity, modesty, or chastity, and that a husband's requiring a wife to have sex against her will is not rape. Harmful racial religious stereotypes also contribute to rape cultures of Black or Mexican men as predators, of Black women as sexually loose, strong, and therefore incapable of being raped, of Muslim women as only victims in need of rescue, or of women of East or South Asian origin as submissive and bound to tradition. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, two-spirit, transgender, or gender non-conforming persons who experience sexual assault may not receive adequate services for reasons of religion, government policy, or discrimination within healthcare. In some settings, privileged white and other men may promote harmful gender ideologies and victimize others. Until we hold white rapists accountable, white and other survivors will continue to suffer from the racist view that white people are unlikely to rape. In short, the criminal justice system, schools, and workplaces hold only a tiny percentage of all offenders accountable, but some communities suffer even more than others. I want to speak now to white people and to all who are outside of specific communities. What can we do concretely? We can work throughout our lives to overcome our implicit racial and other biases. We can learn and teach the full history of slavery and legal segregation with their unpunished sexual assaults against Black persons. Black survivors of rape by a Black person may well hesitate to report to officials out of concern about the unfair treatment of the offender or over-incarceration. But we can all work to demand an end to racial profiling, which will benefit both suspects and survivors. We can learn cultural practices. For example, people in some East Asian countries rarely speak about rape. A college official encountering an East Asian survivor should therefore not urge the student to tell their parents or push them towards therapy. In the history and tradition of some cultures, violated individuals seen as defiled have been expected to commit suicide or separate themselves from their community, and echoes of this live on. We can work against Islamophobia, which may lead Muslims to hesitate to speak openly about sexual violence between Muslims, thereby harming Muslim survivors. And we can support Muslim women, LGBT Muslims, and others who have organized to obtain the rights due to them. We can write to our elected representatives, urging them to work toward restoring to Native American tribes the right to rule themselves. Most importantly, we can listen to survivors from within each community, both informally and in the form of urgently needed research, and support each community's internal efforts to stop sexual violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. When Professor Brooten first told me that she had invited Sarah Deer to campus, I was really excited because I had just assigned her book or chapters of her book for my Intro to Women, Gender, Sexualities course of the MGS 5A, and my students are here today. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Deer, a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma, who was named a MacArthur Fellow in 2014. She is a professor of law at Kansas University, where this semester she's also teaching a honors Intro to Women and Gender Studies. She has worked to end violence against women for over 25 years, with special attention to the intersection of federal Indian law and victims' rights. In 2007, Professor Deer co-authored the landmark Amnesty International report, Maze of Injustice, published in 2007, which documented extensive sexual violence in Native American country. She has been credited with the passage of two critical pieces of legislation: the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010, which increased the sentencing power of tribal courts, and the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act in 2013, which allowed tribal courts to prosecute non-Native men in cases of domestic abuse and violence in against dating partners. Professor Deer has co-authored 4 textbooks on tribal law and recently published a book that we read in class, The Beginning and the End of Rape, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America, which was published by University of Minnesota Press. This book won the Best First Book Award for the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, the American Political Association's Victoria Shook Award, and the La Briola Center's American Indian National Book Award. Professor Deer currently serves as the Chief Justice for the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals. She will speak today about the experience of Native American women and sexual violence. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Imagine living in a world in which almost every woman that you know has been raped. Now imagine living in a world in which 4 generations or more have been raped. Now imagine that not a single rapist has ever been prosecuted for these crimes. That dynamic is a reality for many Native women, and thus, for some Native survivors, it can be difficult to separate the more recent experience of assault from the larger experience that our people have endured through a history of forced removal, displacement, and destruction. All of these events are attacks on the human soul. The destruction of indigenous cultures and the rape of a woman connote a kind of spiritual death that is difficult to describe to those who have not experienced it. It is not only Native women who have been raped, but Native nations as a whole. Data and statistics can be dehumanizing, and I recite them with some trepidation. One rape is one rape too many. But the reality is, most Native women will be victims of sexual assault, and we live with that reality every day. According to the Department of Justice, over half of all Native women in the United States have experienced some form of sexual violence. Mothers in Indian country actually prepare their daughters for the inevitable. My daughter, this is what to do when you're raped. And while there are over 560 federally recognized tribes in this country, each with a unique history, culture, and language, the constant for all Native people is the inevitability of rape. It has not always been this way. Indeed, tribal nations have existed on this continent for nearly 12,000 years. And I believe that it would be impossible for civilizations to sustain themselves this long if we had constantly experienced this high rate of sexual violence. The truth is, our tribal nations traditionally held women in high esteem, in contrast to Euro-American cultures, and we had very low rates of sexual violence. Rape, as a socio-political problem, came to us on boats from Europe, fueled by the ideology of manifest destiny. Rape has been used as a weapon of war, as a method of devastating, dividing, and humiliating its victims on a mass scale. Just as the Trail of Tears, the massacres, and the hundreds of broken treaties have devastated Native nations, rape has served as a tool, as a means to an end, to make Native people disappear from the face of the earth. In order to move forward, we must revitalize legal traditions that inherently prevented rape. For example, the people of my nation, the Muskogee people, have always governed themselves pursuant to laws. Like most tribal nations, the Muskogee people have relied for millennia on sacred oral traditions and ceremonies to establish and enforce legal standards and expectations for behavior. Beginning in the 19th century, the United States federal agents told us that we were required to reduce our sacred oral traditions to writing in order to prove that we were civilized. The very first rape law that my tribe reduced to English writing stood in sharp contrast to Anglo-American rape law. Back in 1825, my ancestors drafted a rape statute which closed with the powerful phrase, "What she say, it be law," an indication that women held legal status and control, particularly in the aftermath of sexual violence. In fact, one could consider this legal philosophy the opposite of that espoused by traditional patriarchal Anglo-American law, in which women were expected to submit to their husbands, and the burden fell on women to stop sexual violence. Why and how have we lost these legal traditions? Tribal nations now fall under the jurisdiction of federal laws and regulations. Our jurisdiction, indeed the very essence of our sovereign power, has been manipulated and warped by a bizarre set of laws imposed under bizarre conditions. Consider the following two limitations on the power of a tribal nation. First, the maximum penalty that our tribal judges can impose for any crime is 1 to 3 years. This limitation applies even to violent offenses like murder and rape. Second, tribal nations are not able to exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit rape and child sexual abuse, period. This is one of the only race-based criminal laws that remains on the books in the United States today. So imagine living in a world where your government is prevented from protecting you. Imagine that you report a violent crime and your government must turn you away from the doors of justice merely because your assailant was a member of a different race. This is an unacceptable injustice imposed by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1978, less than 40 years ago. But Native women are not passive victims. Indeed, our voices and stories have made national impact in recent years. We have fought for laws such as the Tribal Law and Order Act and the Violence Against Women Act to change the laws that bind us and keep us from living out our full potential. We have thus far been successful, but progress is painfully slow. There is still much work to do, and we need more allies in this work. And in order to cultivate our allies, we must be able to reach out about our plight. Programs such as this will enable our movement to grow exponentially. Because rape against Native women is not just a Native problem, it is a national disgrace. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Even though I have read the book with my students, to hear you speak, it was still very shocking and painful to hear those words. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Professor Angela Frederick Amar could not be with us today, but I will introduce her, and then my graduate student, Elizabeth Olson, who is a joint master's student in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program and public policy, will describe her work. So Professor Amar teaches at the Neil Hodgson Woodruff School of Nursing at Emory University and is a member of the National Black Nurses Association. Amar's research focuses on sexual and intimate partner violence, mental health, responses to trauma, and forensic nursing. She has worked to facilitate help-seeking behavior and reporting of violence by adolescent and young adult women. Noting that little research had been done on female African American college students, Amar employed the theory of planned behavior, among other theories, to elucidate the specific barriers that prevent this group from reporting rape, and offered concrete solutions in her groundbreaking articles. She has also published research on Muslim and Chinese women who experience sexual violence, and incorporates race, ethnicity, and religion in her research and training programs on bystander intervention, hindrances to reporting, peer influences, and the role of families and nurses in preventing and responding to such violence. As an advanced psychiatric nurse with dozens of years of forensic experience, Amar has contributed tremendously to the development of forensic nursing and mental health care, which has been critical for the care of trauma victims. She's the recipient of numerous awards, most recently the Excellence in Practice and Policy Award by the Nursing Network on Violence Against Women International. So I'll ask Liz Olson to come up and discuss her work. Thank you so much.
So I'm honored to be here and speak about Dr. Angela Frederick Amar's work. I haven't seen this piece yet, so thank you in advance for your patience with me. So Professor Frederick Amar wished very much to be with us today, but that turned out to be impossible. In her absence, I would like to summarize very briefly several of her publications so that you have a sense of her contributions to this work. Professor Frederick Amar has examined sexual violence from both the public health and nursing standpoints. That is, she aims to reduce sexual violence and to increase reporting so that survivors can obtain the care that they need, and she works to enable nurses to achieve the cultural competency that they need to care well for their patients. For one research study, she surveyed 144 African American college women to ascertain the barriers and hindrances that they face in reporting, posing the question not as what they had done, but as what they would do. She found that these students were more likely to report to campus health services than to campus administrators or to campus security. Factors in deciding to report to the health services included whether they had had injuries, whether they had time to go, and whether the campus had a designated person to handle sexual assault. Factors in deciding to report to campus administrators and campus security included whether they had injuries, whether they had time, whether they had been drinking, and how they would be treated. In other words, these particular Black students apparently had more confidence in healthcare providers than in administrators or campus police, perhaps in part because they felt that nurses and physicians were less likely to judge them for having been drinking or to treat them improperly. In another study, she finds that messages from mothers and extended family members significantly influence whether or not college women will report sexual violence. In a further study, she evaluated a specific bystander intervention program and found it to be of help and something that mental health nurses could employ. A particularly engaging piece is Understanding the Veil, Non-Stranger Sexual Assault of a Muslim Woman. Through a specific case, she helps her audience of nurses grasp why a Muslim woman might not disclose to anyone, even to a healthcare provider treating her for injuries sustained during the assault. Amar knowledgeably describes traditional Muslim cultural practices, such as the separation of women and men, modesty, prohibition of premarital or extramarital sex, and seeing in women the honor of the family. And she analyzes how these may make it difficult for a Muslim woman to recognize that she is a victim of a crime rather than a transgressor of Muslim religious values. Amar stresses that nurses need this cultural competency in order to explain effectively to the patient that a crime has happened to her. At this event, Angela Frederick Amar planned to speak about how bystander intervention trainings need to be culturally competent in order to be effective. For example, she noted that some programs might assume the frequent presence of alcohol, but that at historically Black colleges and universities, that is not the case. I encourage you to read Angela Frederick Amar's work and hope that you can hear her on another occasion.
Thank you so much, and I really do encourage you to read her work, which really takes a culturally sensitive approach to the issue of rape. So I will invite now Professor Brooten to speak about religion and sexual violence.
I just lay there in the early morning light, wondering where God had been last night, writes P.J. Gibson. In contrast, a pseudonymous survivor writes, during the rape, I always knew that God was there and that he didn't want this for me. It wasn't like he was punishing me. These conflicting voices align with Sarah Deer's definition of rape as an invasion of body, mind, and spirit. Survivors cope differently with the spiritual harm of rape. Some question God. Others believe that God was there for them and is there for them in their intense suffering. Some cope with the trauma by praying. African American and Latinas may turn especially to their pastors rather than to the police. But many LGBT persons hurt and rejected by religious communities seek secular healing instead. Religion and religious leaders can contribute to profound healing, or they can hinder healing and efforts to prevent sexual violence. History helps to explain why many religious leaders and people work to prevent sexual violence and to respond with compassion as called for by their religion, while others do not. As an example, Christian history can help to understand why. I explicitly focus on Christianity because when speaking critically about such sensitive questions, I prefer to focus on my own tradition. The New Testament nowhere explicitly condemns rape, whereas it does condemn fornication, adultery, same-sex sexual expression, licentiousness, and lack of spiritual purity. In the world around early Christians, rape was defined mainly as the rape of a virgin who lost value for having been defiled. Some early Christian writers recognized the rape of others, but thought of it differently than we might. For example, one early Christian bishop writes, women who have been corrupted by force are not culpable. Thus, even the slave woman, if she has been violated by her master, is not culpable. The question of canon law here is not whether the question of canon law here is whether rape constitutes fornication or adultery. In other words, has a raped woman sinned? The bishop affirms that a violated woman has not sinned. In the early 13th century, Thomas Aquinas defines contraception and same-sex sexual expression as contrary to nature and therefore worse than incest and rape, which are sinful, but at least natural. In 1902, an 11-year-old Italian girl named Maria Goretti gave up her life in defending her chastity against attempted rape. In 1950, she became a saint as a model for defending her chastity. So we see consent is not always the issue here. Whether the rape survivor has fornicated or committed adultery is the main concern, and whether vaginal rape, albeit sinful, is at least natural. Few Christians hold these views today, which shows how religion changes over time. But these ancient views also still echo. For example, some Christian colleges and universities in the United States have held or threatened to hold rape complainants responsible for transgressing these schools' prohibitions of premarital sex. According to preliminary research, higher levels of fundamentalism correlate with higher acceptance of such views, as that there is no such thing as rape within marriage, or that a rape survivor is partly to blame. We need much more nuanced research on how interpretations of specific passages from sacred scriptures or religious law correlate with a person's views on rape. For example, interpreters have used certain passages to support the idea that married women are obligated to submit to sexual relations whether or not they wish to. The New Testament says, "Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord." And, "I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She is to keep silent." The silencing of women is the silencing of women's experiences, including rape. How survivors understand God matters too. According to one research study, believing in a benevolent God can help to heal from the trauma of rape, while belief in a condemnatory God can hinder it. Many religious communities and people no longer teach wifely submission or focus on sexual purity as a value higher than consent. The rise of female religious leaders has made preventing sexual and domestic violence much higher priorities. Many communities, from Orthodox Judaism to Islam, from Buddhism to the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, are facing up to problems within their own ranks and are drawing upon the strong traditions of God as compassionate, as standing with persons of whichever sexual orientation and gender identity and expression who experience violence. Such leaders and interpretations are desperately needed to address the spiritual harm of sexual assault. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Bernadette, for reminding us that religion must be included in any discussion of sexual violence. So we are moving on to the second part of the program. We'll take a 5-minute break to rearrange the stage a little bit. If you could speak among yourselves about, and maybe in small groups, about what you took away from this first part, something that was new to you, perhaps a new statistic or a new idea, and questions that you might have. So after a short panel discussion, we will open it up for questions from the audience. So just a 5-minute break. Okay, thank you so much. So I thought we would begin our discussion with some very basics. And to discuss the language that we use to discuss rape. There are many terms that we use, or that the press uses: rape, sexual assault, sexual violence, non-consensual sex. why does it matter, and what kind of language should we use?
Oh, this is a really important topic, so I appreciate the opportunity to speak about it. I have sort of two ways that I think about this. I think about it as a lawyer, and as a lawyer, statutory language is really, really important. And so we tend to be moving in the direction of calling it sexual assault. By using the term assault, it's a violent crime. Sexual sort of defines the nature of it. But it's still not it's not a perfect term by any means. We used to, in the law, use this term rape, which was intended, I think, to be all-encompassing, but tended to focus on penile vaginal intercourse and a truly very violent occurrence. I have tried in my thinking outside the law of reclaiming rape as a political tool and using the term rape to describe a spectrum of violations that have a socio or political basis. And so as a lawyer, I tend to use sexual assault. As an advocate and a scholar, I tend to use rape. I often will use them interchangeably. But what's important to me about the word rape is I sort of came of age in the rape crisis movement in the early 1990s. And we were using rape to describe our agencies. The problem with that is that many women and men and LGBTQ two-spirit people were thinking, well, what happened to me wasn't technically rape, right? I didn't have penetration, or my assault was not particularly violent, or I was unconscious, so I don't know if that means rape. And so as an advocacy movement, I think it was important for us to open that spectrum. But I still feel like rape is a powerful word describing a socio-political problem, and so that's why I choose to use it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would say it's important to think of how the term has changed over time. So we today legally also think of rape as penetration or penetration of any bodily orifice by another bodily orifice or an object. And at Brandeis, we have expanded that to include oral sex forced upon a man. So that would not be penetration, but that is equally traumatic. Without the consent of the person. Whereas in the early 20th century in the US, the definition included, it was of a woman only, right. It was penetration only, and it was against her will and by force. So the force requirement was there, which now for the FBI definition of rape is no longer present. And then other things have also changed, such as in the 13th century, an important English jurist, Henry de Bracton, required the so-called hue and cry, that the young woman, the virgin, that was his understanding too, that goes back way back, that it's really, rape is really a rape of a virgin, and we have moved away from that, that she immediately rise up, bring her bloody garment to the village elders and to the provost of the region and to the court, to the Lord, and that she say that she's been raped, and she should do this immediately. Well, that is the most unrealistic expectation of a person who has just experienced such trauma that you can imagine, and we don't accept that view anymore. So I think that as we think about rape and sexual assault, we are the creators. We shape this concept culturally.
Thank you so much. And I'm also reminded in my own field of Jewish studies that the rabbis also imagined or understood rape or added the concept of the pain of the victim, which I thought was really important. So when you talk about rape, the word itself evokes certain emotions, especially the violence and the pain. So I really like the use of that word, especially for political organization.
Can I add there also, ChaeRan, as you know, that particular category is not in the Bible. It's a rabbinic innovation. So it's another example of religion becoming more sensitive and changing over time.
That's right. Thank you.
Another thing that just occurred to me is I've been told by Native elders that certain tribal languages don't have a word for rape. There's no translation. And maybe that was because rape was so rare in these pre-colonial cultures that they didn't even need a word for it.
Wow, that's really telling. So the focus of our panel has been to discuss the intersectionality of sexual violence with race and ethnicity. I was wondering if you can discuss how race shapes social perceptions of victims and perpetrators of assault, and how factors like race and ethnicity might influence, as we said, the reporting of rape to authorities or to clergy and so forth. So what is the role of rape in perceptions?
Do you want to go first on this one too? Okay. Well, I alluded to a few things. There's been a great deal of research on harmful racial sexual stereotypes, and both how these can be internalized, but also simply how they're projected, and that can when Angela Frederick Amar reported in her study the reasons that those black college women whom she surveyed felt uncomfortable or less comfortable going to the police and to the administrators of their university, that they were concerned about how whether they would be treated fairly, how they might be treated. And I think that's a point at which some of this comes in. That is, if the person in authority has a particular view of the sexuality of a particular ethnicity, then that is going to influence how they view this person who is sitting across their desk. And research has shown that black women are less likely to report a rape to the police. If they report, the prosecutor is less likely to prosecute, and if the prosecutor prosecutes, the jury is less likely to convict. And if there is a jury trial and there is a conviction, the penalty will be lower than if the rape survivor were white. So there is definitely a bias that exists, and until we overcome that bias, then we are not protected. The society is not protecting all rape survivors or preventing it.
I would say for Native women, we have been subject to some of this hypersexualization that you mentioned. We just had Halloween, and there's just a plethora of costumes that sexualize Native women, sexy squaw, Pocahontas, those kinds of costumes, which are deeply disturbing, but continue to be sold at your typical Halloween pop-up shop. And I think that, along with other images of Native women in Disney films and the like, really presents Native women as exotic, hypersexualized, which is not unique to Native women. But the other issue is that because of our political status as nations and the understanding of the jurisdictional limitations, I believe that many perpetrators and predators view Native women as being outside the protection of the law. In other words, if I'm a predator and I want to know the easiest target to get away with it, I would target a Native woman.
Yeah, we just watched a video in my 5A class about, it was a testimony of a woman who stated that her daughter had been raped by men who came with condoms with the intent to rape, knowing that they would get away with this. How frequently does this happen, where non-Native men come into, say, a Native American space reservation with this intent? Is it documented?
Well, it's a little difficult to document because we don't have great tools to gather that data. I would say, the first thing we have to understand is that most Native people don't live on reservations.
Exactly.
More than half of Native people reside in urban areas or off-reservation rural areas. So that's one thing to think about. So the jurisdictional quandary doesn't present in that way when you're off-reservation, but there's still a potential racial component to it. Especially Native women who are prostituted or addicted are targeted. The other issue, the dynamic that hasn't been explored to my satisfaction, is border town violence. So there are border towns like Gallup, New Mexico, and Rapid City, where Native women come to do shopping or to go to a bar or that kind of thing, and that non-Natives will sort of sit and wait for that population. Now, I can't document that, but those are the anecdotal stories I've been told about what we call border towns.
Okay. And we had discussed yesterday between us about incest, and this is a very sensitive and taboo subject. The issue, the intersection between incest and race and racial perceptions. Did you want to speak about that a little bit? It's a topic that we usually don't discuss in public. It's a very taboo topic.
Right. Well, so the rise of individuals speaking out about having been sexually abused within their families can have the potential to gravitate to correct the view that the danger is from some other ethnic group. Okay, so the projection has been a black man is dangerous, a Native American Indian man is dangerous, a Muslim man is dangerous, a Mexican man is dangerous. Those are the ones you have to watch out for. Whereas actually, those who are the most dangerous are your own father, or your own brother, or your own mother, or aunt, or sister. It's within the family, the danger is greater. And so it has the potential to be an anti-racist tool, because it actually is taking away from those prejudicial understandings of who the rapists are to who they actually are within the family. But that has to be made explicit. And so I hereby make it explicit.
Did you have anything to add about?
Well, I'm not sure if this is quite on point, but I think what I would say about incest is that when you call, this is a lawyer talking again, when you label a law incest as opposed to child sexual abuse, you really are putting the privacy of the victim at risk, especially in small, isolated rural communities. If somebody's convicted of incest, the victim is sometimes obvious. And that really, especially for a minor, can be devastating. So the conviction of child sexual abuse from that perspective, as opposed to calling it incest, is probably the preferred.
That's a very important distinction to make, yes.
And I would add also that people sometimes will say, so for example, with the question of abortion, should it be allowed in the cases of, should there be an exception made to a prohibition in the case of rape or incest? Well, incest is rape. Okay, it's downplaying it to say that it isn't. I mean, some of it is rape, some of it is other forms of assault, but some of it is rape. So that's another reason for which I think that the term incest can mask. It can seem like, oh, I don't know, a brother and a sister married each other or something. That isn't what this is about.
Yeah, that's important. I was wondering if we could shift the discussion to a socio-historical context. You both brought up the important role that transgenerational trauma can play in victims, that rape that occurs today is not necessarily just in the moment, but is connected to previous traumas. So is there a heightened sense of vulnerability and trauma among certain groups like African Americans, Native Americans, given the legacy of slavery and settler colonialism? It's a big question, but I think a really important one.
Professor Amar's, one of her pieces concerned how messages are transmitted from generation to generation about rape, and she found the centrality of messages by the mother and by other members of the family to be crucial. So if the mother has experienced something, or she or her mother experienced something, and then she passes down the fear, the caution, the inevitability, the hopelessness, the hope, the whatever it is, I'll just slap him if he tries anything with me. Well, that's a different kind of upbringing than it's going to happen. So I think that would be something that I would stress. And then I think from the standpoint of religion also, so say Saint Maria Goretti. So she dies for defending her chastity. I mean, one could say she dies resisting rape, but that isn't the way it was conceptualized when she was made a saint. It was for defending her chastity. So if children are taught, you must defend your chastity is worth more than your life, well, that too is an important message.
Mm-hmm. That's true in some Asian cultures, for example, about the family honor, girls' chastity, so that's still very relevant today. Yeah. And Sarah, did you have some?
Well, I think one of the things we have to think about when we talk about what we usually use in the Native American scholarly context is historical trauma, which can cover a range of different maladies, right? Mm-hmm. Is really thinking about the cosmology of the community that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And I really hesitate in a public forum to try to describe any tribal spiritual belief systems. It's not a comfortable place for me. But I think it's important to say that the cosmology of many tribes, not all, is much less linear than the Western way of thinking. In other words, what happened to your ancestors 400 years ago is not 400 years ago. That you're present with your ancestors. Your ancestors guide you from day to day. And so when your ancestors who have experienced rape and the generations and generations and generations, you carry that pain within you. And I know that's not unique to Native communities, but I think that's something that helps people who don't understand historical trauma think about it. It's a different way that you view your place in the world and the people who have passed before you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm reminded also in the Jewish history context as well, survivors, children, second, third generation carrying that trauma, and so it's not the same, but there are similar intergenerational experiences of trauma. And I was also thinking when you were talking about mothers passing on stories or lessons to their children. I was just reading Sherman Alexie's memoirs, and just his response to his mother's revelation that her mother had been raped, or his mother, sorry, yeah, it was his mother's mother, his grandmother had been raped, and how that impacted him. It was extremely traumatic for him. So it not only impacts girls and daughters, but also sons and boys as well. So.
One thing that I would mention, it's a kind of parallel. That is, it's a kind of salvific parallel, if I could say that, which is the Archbishop of Canterbury a few years ago when he apologized for the role of the Anglican Church in being slaveholding in the Caribbean and of benefiting directly from the labor of enslaved persons. He spoke of the body of Christ. So the body of Christ is a Christian concept found in the New Testament that speaks of the members of the church as members of the body of Christ, as all one body. And he used that image to explain why an apology was not only for the present, it was not only for Christians in the Anglican Church in the present, but also for the body of Christ in the past. Because being of one body meant that one had a responsibility to those Christians in the past who had perpetrated such crimes as slavery, which of course were not illegal, and that one was doing the apology with them and for them. So in other words, there are different ways in which people think about the present and the past, and religions often are ones that have a real understanding of transgenerational and what it means to have had spiritual ancestors and so forth. Now, the problem was it was apologies and not reparations, but it was a start if there is a finish.
Actually, that's an excellent segue into this last question about justice, crime and punishment. Some have suggested that, or proposed that restorative justice might serve as an alternate form of punishment to incarceration, especially given the high proportions of people of color who are imprisoned. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on restorative justice for, as a punishment for, or no, not a punishment, restorative justice as a response to sexual violence?
You should go this first.
I should go first.
This one you should go
this
first.
one's yours.
And then I'll go after.
I've gone
I
on
have a
record
lot of
here.
thoughts.
Restorative justice is a concept that we can resolve a problem in a collective way. And it's a very common technique used by tribal people, Native people in the United States. Traditionally, we didn't have really hierarchical justice systems where you have the judge, the attorneys, the clients, and that's the sort of hierarchy. Instead, the concept was to resolve a problem in a circle or a vertical plane. And this is, again, I'm making broad generalizations because every tribe is different. The concern I have about using that technique, the philosophy that comes with that technique in the context of sexual violence, is that it is not just a dispute. It is not just a misunderstanding that we can work out together. I think that restorative justice is a very powerful tool, and I want to reclaim it for many, many different types of problems, juvenile delinquency, divorce, those kinds of things. But I worry about what happens to a survivor who is told that this is the traditional way that we deal with problems, and that your perpetrator will be allowed to mitigate his behavior based on colonization, for example. That my grandfather went to boarding school, and that's why I am the way I am. And I don't believe that political oppression really liberates someone from the requirement that you treat others humanely. So when we think about doing that sort of restorative technique in the context of sexual violence, I become very concerned. Now, that's not to say I think the Western system has it right. And I do believe that Native people are vastly over-incarcerated. But I think there's other ways to deal with that when we look at things like drug addiction, that those kinds of offenses don't deserve the kind of imprisonment we're talking about. But when we talk about sexual assault, there are some people that are too dangerous to be in our communities, and that's...
Yeah, I also find the concept appealing for many things, and I have concerns about it for sexual violence. Anything that involves touching and beyond. And from the religious standpoint, a concern that I have from specifically from within Christianity is the pressure to forgive. So there can be, this is something that pastors can engage in or others can engage in, that it's the Christian thing to forgive and you should forgive. Maria Goretti forgave the perpetrator who had murdered her while she was on her deathbed. So that was seen as very meritorious to forgive immediately. And I am not, many people find healing in forgiveness, find it to be a spiritual practice that is important to them. But it should not be pressured. One should not be pressured into it. And I am concerned that subtle pressures can exist, that, well, really you should be involved in restorative justice because otherwise you're vindictive and so forth. And I think for me the key issue is, does the survivor have a right not to see the perpetrator on a regular basis? Does the survivor have a right to the space first and then the offender after that, but that their interests go around the survivor? I think this is an area where intersectionality is so important because we need to consider the over-incarceration of Black persons, the over-incarceration of Native persons, the over-incarceration of brown-skinned persons in the country, and work on those. So that's why working on those is essential. We have to consider also the prison conditions in the United States and not assume that they are what all prisons are. And I think many U.S. citizens are not familiar with the fact that many Western European countries will not extradite to the United States on the belief that the person extradited will be tortured here. So that is, a view that many nation states hold. And so those are issues we need to address. And then the situation might be different if incarceration were a different phenomenon, and if it were rare, and if it were fair. Those would be different circumstances.
Okay, thank you. I think we could discuss everything for much longer, but I wanted to open it up for questions. Now, we have a microphone here, and we are recording the session, so I would welcome questions from the audience. If you can come up to the microphone, or should we take it to them, or leave it
No,
there?
I think have
Okay.
to come up.
Yeah, if you
Then
can
they
come
be-
up
then they
and
can be
ask
photographed,
questions. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I don't mean to be first, but I'm really excited. Thank you also for offering this opportunity to have this really important conversation. My name is Daryl Hamilton. I'm actually a pastor over at First Baptist Church in Jamaica Plain. I'm also a recent graduate of Wake Forest University School of Divinity. And so I actually have two questions I'd like to address to both of you. One more on a corporate level as my vocation as a pastor, and one a little bit more on the personal side. And so one to you, Dr. Brooten. I wanted to ask you this question. How would you suggest preachers, or particularly black male preachers, educate and preach from the pulpit on the issue and the problem of rape and sexual violence, particularly in light of some of the traditions and explicit representation of sexual violence in our Judeo-Christian scriptures? I'm thinking about Dinah, I'm thinking about Tamar, so that way we can actually really have a direct conversation on this issue. And I don't mean just some little study groups and Bible studies, but literally from the pulpit. So I think that actually has a little bit more of a resonance with the congregation. And then also, Dr. Deere, I wanted to ask this question too. In regards to the legal aspects around sexual violence and sexual assault, I'm thinking about it also in terms of my legacy as a black man, and our continued legacy of hypersexualization, particularly in the American cultural imagination. And then also, as a result of the incarceration rates and the punishments levied on black men, particularly for instances of false allegations of sexual assault. And so I wanted to just kind of ask you, what sorts of legal responses would you suggest in order to kind of address this sort of racialized issue, in order to, for the sake of justice, for marginalized groups who are also falsely accused of certain things like that. That I'm a little sensitive to that as well, in the sake of this conversation. So those are my two questions.
Thank you. Wow, wonderful. Okay, that's good. Thank you so much, and welcome, Pastor. I followed closely when each of you registered. And I Googled some of you, so I'm familiar with some of you. I'm very excited to have so many different kinds of people here. And I Googled you and saw your church and saw your face. And so when you came up, I immediately recognized you. So welcome, Pastor. I think that the story that you referenced, especially the 2 Samuel account of Amnon and Tamar, would be very helpful, because that is such a pointed account of a brother raping his sister. It is so non-idealizing. The full humanity of those figures is there, and the cruelty of Amnon is there, and then the fact that he has a male companion who urges him on and supports him, and whom he sends, and so forth. That the idea of bystander intervention, and what happens when, instead of having a bystander intervene, a colleague or a friend is there to support the rapist. I think that there's so much in that story that I think that would be a wonderful story to preach on, and you're absolutely right. It makes such a difference if it comes from the pulpit, So I encourage you in that.
Thank you for your question about the role of hypersexualized racism that men of color in this country have to confront every day. I think that the constant conversation about incarceration can never be enough.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess from my perspective as a law professor, one of the things that I think is critical is that we teach that history and the contemporary manifestation of it, of black men being accused of rape, of Native men being called savages, and the assumption that all Native men are rapists. They're very similar sort of ways of thinking. I think the only way that we can start to push our system in a new direction is in the legal academy, when we're training future judges, future prosecutors, future defense attorneys. The problem is that many law professors who teach criminal law don't teach rape at all. You can't cover every crime in a semester, and so there is some legacy of criminal law professors skipping the story altogether. But we have to not only teach rape to future legal practitioners, we have to teach that story of racism, about blaming men of color for rape, especially of white women. And so that's one key, and in the police academies as well.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you can teach about, what the box of, what constitutes sexual assault is. But if you don't tell that backdrop, then we can't intercede with the sort of trend. I think that's a really critical change that needs to happen in the legal academy.
Hello, thank you for the wonderful panel. I'm Jaspreet. I'm a fresh graduate from Brandeis in Women Gender Studies. And I was thinking about, I work with marginalized communities in India, so work around caste-based discrimination there. And one of the things that I've seen in my dissertation is this idea of women being under men or being owned by men in certain ways as wives, as mothers, as daughters, and rape of lower caste communities as a means of hurting the whole community, because it's a way of also showing that you're hurting the masculinity of the community, since it's the notion that the men are not able to protect their own women. So I just wanted to ask, is that something which is also reflected in Native American communities?
I don't think I've ever really thought about that before. I really thank you for the question. I think it is really frustrating to be living in a tribal community, whether you're a man or a woman, and see that the system is not going to protect victims, whether they're women, men, children, LGBTQ, Two-Spirit. It's devastating, and it really cultivates a sense of hopelessness. If my tribe can't protect me, then who will? So it does, I guess, emasculate in some ways this idea that we have a system that can solve this problem, a system that can intercede and hold people accountable, and we don't have that in Indian country. And it hasn't been very long. I mentioned during my opening remarks that it was 1978 that the U.S. Supreme Court said no tribe can prosecute a non-Indian. And the devastation that it has wrought on tribal communities, I should say, certainly Native people rape. Absolutely, Native American men and women rape. But the sense that we're without remedy is devastating.
Hi, my name is Lena Arthur. I'm also a recent graduate. I just finished up my doctorate at Harvard's History of Science department, and I wrote a dissertation about the history of sexual violence in America. So rape is a crime of power, not sex. This is an important distinction that feminists made in the 1970s, which was unfortunately necessary then.
Yes.
But I started thinking a lot about vulnerability, including how our beliefs around sexual violence, including our skepticism about it, construct these areas of vulnerability. So we touched on this a little in this discussion about how people might purposely target Native women because they know they won't be held accountable. I think this happens in a different form with other vulnerable populations, including because we scrutinize the behavior, psychology, and risk calculations of victims so closely. So thinking about the risk management checklist that pretty much any woman will be familiar with, right? Don't walk home alone at night, watch your drink, why are you in the frat house or in the club, why are you wearing revealing clothing? If you hold this up in a dark mirror, it becomes a playbook, right? You pick somebody who's young or brown or less protected under the law, LGBT or so on. So we're in a really important cultural moment, and seeing increased scrutiny of the behavior, programming and risk calculations of the perpetrator. So my question is to you, what does increased accountability look like at the community level, community broadly construed, rather than if we are simply leaving it to the criminal legal system?
You go first, Isna.
Community accountability is something that can't be, the importance of that can't be overstated. There are many people who, despite ample evidence, aren't convicted in court for a variety of reasons. And so what I've tried to think about when I think about tribal communities, tribal nations, is how can we conceive of community accountability outside the justice system, or in parallel to criminal justice. There's an interesting dynamic that is starting to sort of be reinvigorated. And many tribes have been doing this for a long time, but more recently to reignite this sense that when you commit certain kinds of crimes, you're no longer welcome in the community. And that's what we call banishment or exclusion, which tribes, many in treaties have the right to do, to exclude people, to banish people. What I've seen is that a lot of times the tribes that are doing that are focused on drug traffickers and not rapists. And so what I really want to think about is, if somebody has committed a crime or a series of crimes that are just, the person themselves is just unable to be in the community and have the community be safe. And so banishment or exclusion is one thing that tribes have that maybe other communities of color, other marginalized communities don't have. But we have to be really cautious about banishment because there is no guarantee that the perpetrator will not simply go to a new community and continue the behavior, right? So when we think about banishment as a tool to keep our community safe, and we don't have to have a conviction to do that necessarily. We need due process, but not necessarily criminal conviction. We just have to be very thoughtful about it. But for me, I've talked to so many survivors who have said something along the lines of, I just want people to believe me. Yeah. That's what I want. And so raising up ways in which those stories can be broadcast, made available to people, and people believe the victim, people believe the survivor. And whatever that means, in ceremony, in public addresses, in dance, artwork, the sense that my voice matters and that I am believed. Yeah. And that is different for each community.
I think the rise of bystander intervention training is crucial here also, because it is helping people to see what I can do within a community, basically to change the community by being more accountable to one another. And here these trainings need to become more culturally competent so that these differences, the differing responses to different persons become more evident. So for example, say in a fraternity situation where there's been drinking and a woman is quite intoxicated and a guy says to her, let me take you home, and that looks like it's a bad situation. She doesn't look like she is able to consent. He's saying he's going to take her home. We don't know what's going to happen. And someone else could intervene. Well, for a black man to intervene could be more risky than for a white man to intervene. So that needs to be taken into account. And if the woman is black or if the man is black, well, that could change the scenario too. So, you know, one simply needs to take everything into account when doing these trainings. But it seems to me that those are actually, I mean, we know that those are actually changing attitudes and reducing violence. Okay, we've got lots of questions here.
Good afternoon. My name is Truth Hunter, and I came here from Connecticut College with a group of colleagues.
I saw you did the Connecticut College contingent. I thought, how did we get the Connecticut College contingent?
Right.
Welcome.
Well, we've been tasked with a project to really get students to engage in this conversation, which is about what this talk is about today, the intersection between race and sexual violence and gender and all those different things that are coming up. So I have a very practical question. You know, what do you all recommend for taking all this knowledge, all this scholarly work that we talked about today? How do we translate it into practical everyday practice? Like, what would that look like? Some examples of programming, some examples of community forums. How do we integrate it into the campus culture beyond lectures so that it can really begin to influence behavior and decision making? So just some practical examples of what that would look like.
Well, I think working together, I mean, partly what this is doing is it's bringing academic research, but we're speaking also as advocates. Right. You know, we're not only speaking about, you know, I wrote this paper and these were the results and let's go on to the next paper. We want change. So I think that for practitioners to work together with academics, you know, to try to discern, and then I think that the students on each campus know what works for them, you know, and will have ideas on how they want to do things. But the Feminist Sexual Ethics Project would be very happy to work with you and with anybody else who's interested in doing it. Yeah.
I think what is key and critical is exactly what's happened here, is that you have advocates at every event. I think whether you're doing a lecture or a spoken word, or a dance recital that deals with sexual trauma, if you don't have advocates in the room, it can derail pretty quickly. It's triggering, and people who are survivors or even friends or family of survivors dread hearing the topic. But once you pass the word that you're going to be safe in this space, and that we're going to make sure that if you do have an emotional reaction, that there are people there who can help you with that, is absolutely vital to any campus work that can be done. And unfortunately, I've seen in some places where it becomes an academic issue only, and you don't think of bringing in advocates to that space. Yeah. So I'm sort of new to campus, contemporary campus anti-rape activism, but I can't overstate enough the importance of having advocates in the room, just so more people will come, frankly. Yeah.
You know, I think also implicit bias training, that seems to me to be crucial, the implicit bias training, because we all have these implicit biases, and I don't know, I just keep discovering more and more of my own, you know? It's not going to take a whole lifetime to do it. But the more that we can become aware, we really can be helpful to all kinds of people. And people are so forgiving, you know, also. That's the other part of it. If you're trying, you know, people will work together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for your work.
I'm Yi. I'm an undergraduate student at Brandeis. I'm an international student from China. So I'm amazed by your talk about, Ms. Dear, your talk about the language, the power of the English language when rape, this word, was not even translated in some indigenous language. In the past summer, I was also helping the school to translate some foreign resource foreign in Chinese. And I feel like there are a lot of words that are not even translatable, especially the gender and sexuality. These concepts are really generated on like really European, Western-centered concepts. I'm thinking like, I'm still formulating my question, but I just want to throw it on the table, and I just, how we, is our talk today still like, because our talk today is in English, I was still like really centered on the Western European perspective because of this powerful language, and how can we really de-Europeanize this concept to benefit a lot of culture groups in this country?
Yeah. It's a great question, but it's far from me to give a solution. I can say that I agree, and I think that the more people work together and explain what the situation is in each country, the concepts in each country, then together people can find solutions for how to talk about it. But it would have to be Chinese people finding on your own, for yourselves, in discussion with others, but for yourselves, and then for those of us to read what you write or listen to what you teach, and then to use that to help to train campus adjudicators and judges and lawyers and so forth, and juries especially. I'm really concerned about juries too, which is why that's potentially most people. Is that an answer, or it's a question back? I guess.
Yeah, I feel like not even because I'm an international person, I feel like in this country there are still a lot of culture groups, like immigrant families. They're deeply influenced by this culture.
Yes.
And because of this powerful language, sometimes like when we talk about gender sexuality, it could be highly excluded, but this country should not really be only founded upon the Western and European values.
Yes.
So like how we really do, like even in the institutional level of Brandeis, how we Europeanize this idea to actually benefit the immigrants, like students, immigrants, and the international communities. Yeah.
I would love to keep talking to you. I'm here. I get to talk to you.
I'm leaving.
You're leaving.
I have to go back to Kansas.
So how you cope with that perspective in your own indigenous community?
Well, I mean, certainly patriarchy has infiltrated tribal communities, Western patriarchy. Not everywhere, but it's prominent in a lot of tribal communities today. And so when we talk about rape, we're also talking about how we decolonize our brains, our thinking about this, how we challenge those Western ideals that were forced and indoctrinated, sometimes through forced Christianization and other religious belief systems. And so it's not just that we're talking about sexual assault, we're talking about how patriarchy has become this foreign alien that we sit with. And so we have to talk about that if we're going to really get to the heart of what rape is all about. But I think that you're right. I mean, the Western system traditionally hasn't done a very good job with sexual assault, so why would we turn to it? As immigrants, as tribal communities, as other marginalized groups. But somehow we get trapped into that. That's the only way things can be done. So we have to resist that whenever we can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question actually follows that up really well. My name is Anya Parrish. I'm a master's student here at Brandeis, getting my master's in both public policy and women, gender, and sexuality studies. My question is, in today's volatile political climate, immigrants without documentation are reluctant to report rape to police, and we've already seen a decrease in reporting across the country since January. And this is even though reporting the crime could actually lead to an immigrant status. Could you speak a little bit about the intersection of this concept of citizenship in terms of both rape culture and trying to achieve any sort of path toward justice?
No, I understand. Just to explain, so in other words, an immigrant who is sexually assaulted could apply for a U visa and could obtain a visa on the grounds of the sexual assault or the domestic violence, but then is afraid to because of the fear of deportation. That's the situation you're speaking about.
And for the U visa, you have to be sponsored by the police, and you have to show that you're continuing to cooperate with them. So it has to show a continued relationship that, with a lot of police a lot of police organizations now cooperating with Immigration and Customs Enforcement enforcement to participate in deportation.
Right.
It makes
Right.
more immigrants fearful.
Right. Yeah, it shows how rape never happens in a vacuum. We can never just look at that specific act. It always has to be in the context of the political circumstances of the person, the political and economic circumstances of the person. It shows also then the potential for the prevention of violence in working to ensure justice for immigrants.
I think what's really interesting, I don't know if this is going to actually answer your question, but I think what's really interesting is when the Violence Against Women Act was up for reauthorization in 2012, VAWA became a partisan issue for the first time. Yeah. And there were 3 particular problems that split Congress. Yeah. Protections for immigrants, restoration of tribal jurisdiction, and additional protections for LGBTQ communities. Right. It's all part of the same system of oppression, right? And I have Native friends in the Southwest who are often mistaken for being Latino or being Mexican. And so they confront that. The funny question or funny thing one of my friends said when he was asked, are you Mexican, is, where's your green card, pilgrim? I'm from here. But there are certainly border issues, particularly the southern border. We have some tribes that span international borders, both at the southern border and the northern border. And so some of these tribes can be safe places for people to go. But that conversation is sometimes difficult to start. And a lot of times there is a sense that, we've had an immigration problem, tribes have had an immigration problem for 500 years. And so the rhetoric of how we talk about that can sometimes, I think, be a barrier to trying to work collaboratively with people who are here, undocumented people who are here and in danger. There's much more work to be done here. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and then we have to fill out a conclusion survey, but we can talk afterwards with the panel. So we'll have one more question, and you'll have an opportunity to speak with the speakers. Okay. Thank you, Liz.
I'm so lucky to have the last question. Thanks so much for your time and for all of your work. So I'm Liz. Like Anya, I'm a master's student in public policy and women's gender and sexuality studies. And I hope that this question will be a good follow-up to what Anya asked. And it might primarily be for Professor Deer because it's about VAWA. So that when VAWA was reauthorized in 2013, we were reauthorized until 2018. So we're looking potentially at another fight to reauthorize VAWA.
Absolutely.
And it's very much an imperfect tool
Absolutely.
because of continued exclusions and because of its alliance with police and with the carceral state. But it's an important one because it's sort of all we have in many ways. So I'm wondering, given the current political landscape, what your concerns are around potentially losing some of the protections that we gained in 2013, and what you see as priorities as we look at the next reauthorization of the Act.
Well, thank you for the question, because I'm a VAWA nerd. I don't know how else to say VAWA geek, despite its problems.
You are.
Yeah.
I hesitate to tell you what the challenges are going to be for sake of giving a playbook to the opposition. But we know what the opposition is about. We've seen it. It's not going to be brand new to us. But one of the things that maybe end on a happy note is that new legislation has been introduced just in the last month to expand the tribal jurisdiction fix to include sexual assault.
Yeah.
So there, I don't have high hopes for this particular legislation coming to fruition, but it's out there. But we will see some of the same fights occur. Losing protection is a scary proposition. It's one thing to say we're not going to fund this project anymore, or we're not going to prioritize this program, this grant program anymore, but to actually backpedal on the protections that we do have is something that we should all be very vigilant about. But I remain hopeful. A lot of people told me when I was a young attorney that we would never see a fix for that 1978 Oliphant decision in our lifetime. And they told me to stop trying to talk about it. It was just not worth it. And we managed to do a little bit of it. So I challenge people to tell me that it won't happen. It will.
Could you tell people about the Heidi Height Camp thing so people might,
sure.
because people may want to write to their elected representatives about this bill. Yeah.
So there's a couple bills right now that have been introduced in the Senate. The easiest way that you can find them is to go to the website for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. And the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs has, including a hearing just held about 2 weeks ago about missing and murdered Native women, which is a new topic not for us but for Congress. And so when you go to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs website, they're going to have information about there's at least 2 bills. One is about missing and murdered Native women. The other is about expanding the fix to include sexual crimes committed by non-Indians. And there will be more to come, and many of these will be folded into the VAWA reauthorization, but they're out there. And so it's exciting to know that, and it's inspiring to know that we're not going to give up.
Thank you so much to our panelists and for the audience for being here. Now, video clips of the conference will be available on the Feminist Sexual Ethics website. And if you could fill out the closing questionnaires that have been passed out in the audience, we'd really appreciate it because the responses are important to us. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you again. Okay.